In 1980, an organization started in Santa Monica so that people could have a better death. It lasted 25 years and started people thinking about how they might want to plan for a peaceful, dignified, and humane death of their choosing. That was the Hemlock Society. Now, in 2015, there is a worldwide effort to expand the choices people have at the end of their lives. This documentary, these interviews, are to record the words and thoughts of the three of us who are sort of pioneers in the Right to Die movement. We all were affiliated with the Hemlock Society, as well as with the Final Exit Network, Hemlock's successor, and with the World Federation of Right to Die Societies. We are all octogenarians and are eager to record our almost 100 years of collective experience and thoughts and memories before we lose them. It is encouraging that so many younger people are now involved in this struggle to achieve a dignified death. We hope these ramblings might provide an understanding and foundation for their work. My name is Faye Girsh, and in all modesty, I count myself one of those pioneers. But we have with us today the founder of the Hemlock Society, the man who has been most prolific in writing on this subject for the public, and who continues to provide worldwide communication through his online listserv. Derek Humphry, on whose shoulders the rest of us stand. Soon we will include Dr. Richard McDonald, who is the medical director for Hemlock and now involved with the Final Exit Network. Though the three of us have been with people who chose a peaceful death, Dick has probably had more of these experiences than anyone. But now, here's Derek. Welcome, Derek.
Hello, glad to be here.
You have been very transparent about your life. You have written a book about it, Good Life, Good Death, your autobiography. You can be Googled and your whole story is on the web. And in the DVD that you made, the Final Exit DVD, you talk about how you helped your wife, Jean, die. And so, to summarize, if I may, you can do it better, but you were a journalist in England. You worked for the Sunday London Times. You were married happily to Jean and had 3 sons. And she developed breast cancer, which spread to her bones.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
Well, she, despite all the medical treatment that was available in Britain and good pain management and everything that could be done, she was crucially terminally ill. And on one occasion she nearly died. And then a few days later, when she came out of the coma, I went in to see her, of course, and she perked up and she said, I want you to help me to die.
That must have been a shock.
Well, it was certainly a surprise. And, but I said, okay, I will, but what do you want me to do? You know, I hadn't given the matter any thought. And this was 1974, the subject of assisted suicide, euthanasia, or whatever you call it, was not a public subject.
No, probably because doctors were helping people die very quietly, wouldn't you think?
Oh, yes, yes. I think I would have had to gone to a dictionary and looked up the meaning of the word euthanasia. I certainly had never used it. Anyway, I said, what do you want me to do? And she said, go to a doctor, get an overdose of lethal drugs, put them away quietly, and when I'm ready to die, you hand them over to me without any discussion, and I take my life. She also added the rider. She said, if I ask for this too soon, or I'm addled with so many painkillers that I'm taking, or there's a miracle cure for cancer, don't give me the drugs, don't hand them to me. But it was there was no question of injection or anything like that, or she was going to do it herself, so long as I provided the drugs. She was bedridden, of course, and couldn't get them herself. So I went to a doctor in London that I knew, and I knew he was a kind and thoughtful man, although we'd never discussed this issue, and he didn't know Jean. And I explained the situation to him and what she wanted.
So you were putting him at risk.
Oh yes.
And he knew
yes.
that.
But then we trusted each other. He took me to pieces about her illness, how it was, what the treatment she'd had, or what stage it was. And then he said, she has no quality of life left. And he went to his medicine cabinet and gave me the lethal drugs. And we shook hands on a pact that I would never reveal his name.
And you never have.
And I never have, because this was in England, and we were both committing a crime. He was prescribing lethal drugs, which he shouldn't do, and to a non-patient, and I was assisting suicide, which in English law still is. Up to 14 years imprisonment can be earned by that. But what Jean wanted seemed to me and to him common sense, and it was her wishes. She was an intelligent, thoughtful woman, and had suffered greatly. The boys and I had witnessed and helped her, and
How
seen
old
her
was she
suffering
around this
over the
time?
years.
How old was she?
She was 42 at the time of her death.
Yeah. There's a lot of pictures of her around, but I think
she was in
they're
the prime of life, and she was desperate to live. She wanted to live the rest of her life, but she faced up to her death with realism and sensibility. She'd seen her mother die about 5 years earlier in great pain and suffering, not properly looked after by the doctors and so forth. And she must have vowed, that's not going to happen to me. And so I took the drugs home, put them in a secret place out of anybody's touch. And I said to Jean, I have them, and when you ask for them, they are there. And it gave her sort of consolation. She took a third chemotherapy. She didn't want to end her life. And it gave her a few months remission. And we had some happy times, although, she was very ill, but, we had a good Christmas. And then
she had her cancer had spread to her bones by that
yes,
time,
it spread
so
to
she
her
was
bones,
pretty
and then
fragile.
within a couple of months, it spread to all over her body. All her vital organs were there, and the doctor said, to me, and she's dying. There's nothing what we can do about it. But they gave good pain control, and the best there was in England. And she took all the pain medications. She was in great pain, but then within minutes the pain would be reduced but of course she would usually fall asleep under the influence of the drugs and so forth. So it got worse, and one week I detected a change in her, and there was a sort of positiveness. And then she woke up one morning, and she was crucially ill. I think she probably only had, I can only guess, perhaps a month to live or so. And she just quietly said to me, "Is this the day?" And that's the biggest question, whether I should agree to that it is the day. And I prevaricated somewhat, and I said, well, the pain is getting worse. You'll have to go back in the hospital for specialized treatment and so forth. And immediately I showed some sort of a sense. She said, "I'll die at 1 o'clock today."
That's a determined woman.
She'd made up her mind. Unknown to me, she'd sent the 3 boys. She'd sent me on a fool's errand to the market to get food we didn't need. And she called the 3 boys in and said goodbye to them. I didn't know that. She'd done that privately, but she told them that she was going to die the next day. And they'd seen her suffering, and they knew her, and they, reluctantly understood, and just stood back, anyway, we spent a delightful morning together. We talked about all sorts of things. We'd had 2 quarrels in our 20 years of marriage. We were never separated, but we disagreed over the buying of a house and whether I should move to London or not, but we settled those. And we talked over the happy times and so forth. And to my amazement, she said, feel free to marry again whenever you want to. And I burst into tears at that. To me, it was such an amazing statement. And then we talked, and we played our favorite music, and she said, now you've got to get back to work again, and we get by this. And she said, go and tell my father how I died. I don't want him to think that I died like Mother did. And she made me promise to go and to find him and tell him. And when it came up towards 1 o'clock, there was a clock on the wall, and I thought, well, if she doesn't ask for it, then I don't do anything. I'll just wait and see. But right on 1 o'clock, she said, time, you better go and get it. And so I did. I went in and I found the drugs. I mixed them into a cup of coffee because I knew they would be bitter and nasty to drink. With a lot of sugar into the mug of coffee. And I took it back to her, and the boys were sprawled around on the settees, and I said, she's preparing to die, and they just sort of grunted or something like that. And I went in and took it to her, put it down on the bedside table, and she said, is that it? I said, yes, if you drink that cup of coffee, you will die. And she looked at it, and I got on the bed, gave her a hug and a kiss, and we said our last goodbyes. I got off the bed, and so she could lift the coffee to her mouth, and she picked up the mug of coffee of her own volition and drank it down. And just before she passed out, she said, goodbye, my love. And she passed out, and within 50 minutes she was dead. And I was staggered. Her courage and determination to do this on her own terms, in her own way, was quite amazing and rewarding in a way. I thought, such courage, such decency in the face of this worst adversity you could have is to be dying at 42 in the bloom of life. And, but that's how she handled it.
To jump ahead a little bit, you met Anne, you came to the United States, and you wrote about Jean's death, this book that, if most people don't know about it, they should know about it, Jean's Way. That was very courageous to let it all hang out, and you certainly let it all hang out in this book.
Yes. I wrote it in England.
I wrote it in England before you came here.
And because I had, if you want to look back, after Jean's death, and I knew I had technically committed a crime, but I went into the Times library, which I, of course, as a journalist there, had access to, and I read through all the assisted suicide stories going back 50 years in the Times of London. And I was horrified. It happened again and again with good, decent people hauled into court and none of them were punished. The judge would always say, you are guilty in a Christian society and you shouldn't have done this, but go home. I'll suspend your sentence,
Whoa,
or I'll
really?
give you parole, or they would find an excuse not to actually punish them. They'd admonish them but not punish them. And I thought, this is wrong. This is a bad law, that people have got to be dragged into courts for this act of love. And that's when I decided to write Jean's Way, which is isn't a campaigning book, it's a very factual account of what happened between us, warts and all.
Of course, it's been
which ends
translated
up with
into
a statement of the law.
Yeah. Translated into how many languages now?
About 6 different languages:
Yeah.
Turkish, Spanish, Italian.
So it really struck a chord
Japanese,
with a lot
Chinese,
of people.
yes. Oh, yes, it was a bestseller, and took people by surprise. Took me by surprise that it was so interesting, and began to be asked to talked about it to Rotary clubs and Lions clubs and university groups and medical students. I kept on getting these inquiries. And I did a lecture tour of Australia. And in some of the remote towns of Australia, there would be a packed audience. And I thought, Jean and I did, why are these Australians turning out to hear me? And I realized I was saying something that people wanted to hear and hadn't heard publicly before. Now, Helping to Die is not new, but coming out into the open with it was new. And when I got back, I was on a television program, and they said, interviewer, Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes fame, in his blunt, what are you going to do about it, Derek? And I said, I'm going to form an organization and change the law. And then when I realized that was in my mind. So within a couple of months, I announced the formation of the Hemlock Society.
Tell us about the...
It is based, it comes from Socrates and his association with hemlocks, what is famous. The ancient Romans and Greeks, so we hear, often took their lives, if they had to or for whatever reasons, with an overdose of hemlock. So we called it the Hemlock Society, because Socrates didn't just, he talked with his pals about it. Should I or shouldn't I? And should I take extradition instead, exile instead? And that was what we wanted people like Jean to talk about, ending their life. And perhaps not do it, at least discuss it, don't do it precipitately or so forth. And eventually, the Hemlock Society was founded with 2 goals. One, to help people as much as possible currently, and the longer term view was frame a law and get that law passed throughout America.
And you managed to get yourself a pretty distinguished board, and you got 1 member, if I remember correctly, and then you doubled it the next week, I think. Isn't that the story? The press said...
What's your question?
Well, first of all, you had a distinguished board of directors.
Yes. You see, I formed a non-profit corporation in California, and I had to have a board. And I think it was a board of 6, I think it had to be, according to law. And so the one person who stood up publicly alongside me was Professor Gerald LaRue, who was a professor of biblical history at USC in Los Angeles. And
he died just a few months ago.
Yes, he died recently.
Yeah.
But outside the first Hemlock meeting, I said to him, well, you're president, Gerald. He said, why me? I said, you're the only member of that monk society. And he laughed and they accepted it. And was a very fine president for about the next 10 years. Was a distinguished figure. Let me run it, but kept an eye on things and chaired the board meetings and did great work.
To get back to the book, Jean's Way, you wrote that with impunity. You said you were questioned back in England, but nothing was done about it.
Yes, when the book came out, it attracted enormous publicity, and one of the newspapers called the director of public prosecutions. In England, there's one top prosecutor for the whole country, and said, this newspaper said, what are you going to do about Derek Humphry's book, and because he admits the crime? And the director said, I'll investigate it. And he did. He called the local police and had the police started. And police, by arrangement, came to me. 2 detectives came, and as soon as they came to the door, I said, I'm guilty. I did it. The book is true, and whatever I said on television is true. That took the wind out of this.
I guess. Yeah.
They wanted to know who the doctor was. I said, I'm not going to tell you. Well, we got to know it. You've been asked to kingdom come. I am not going to tell you ever. And that was it. The director of the police interviewed family and doctors and looked into the whole matter. Most important, they talked to Jean's girlfriends. And Jean apparently, not in my presence, had said to them on odd occasions, I'm not going through to the end with this. I'm going to end it myself. And they told the police that. They said, gee, it was Jean's plan, it wasn't Derek's. And that's what helped me, because if I'd been bad in any way, encouraging or pushing, then I would have been in trouble. But the evidence of the girlfriends was that Jean had talked about this quietly. And I got a letter from the director of public prosecution saying, I'm not going to prosecute you, and I admire Jean's courage in handling her end. So there was no case brought, thank goodness.
I think we both know in the 40 years since you've done that many people have helped their loved ones die. And several people have written about it, as you did. And I'm thinking of 2 people, Betty Rowland, who wrote Last Wish about her mother's death, helping her mother die, and John West, who wrote his book about helping both of his parents die. And again, with impunity, I don't think they were even questioned.
No.
And then there was, in New Zealand, Leslie Martin, who wrote about her mother's death, and Sean Davison, who wrote about his mother's death, and they were both prosecuted.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, is it random that this happens, or is it depends on the country? Or
I think probably, well, as I said, Jean's girlfriends saved me, in a sense. Their evidence got me off the hook, in a sense. Although I was guilty of assisting, and the prosecutor could have prosecuted me, but he saw it as not. What prosecutor you get, and obviously the prosecutor was on my side, sympathetic, and ruled in my favor. With the other cases you mentioned, they've not been so fortunate.
They didn't even have prosecutions. I mean, they just, well, in New Zealand they did, and they were, Leslie had to serve time in jail, and Sean had to serve house arrest, but yeah, but Betty Rowland never did, and John West never did, so
No.
Sort of interesting.
But in a couple of other cases they have,
But not because they wrote a book, but for other reasons they got caught or whatever.
yes. Oh, it's a risky. We need to change the law. That's always been the 2 strings to my bow. Help if you have to. Change the law as best you can democratically.
Well, I've succeeded you as head of the Hemlock Society and kept the same 2 goals in mind, and you help people die eventually by writing Final Exit, which is the classic book of helping people die. That was 1991 this came out?
1991.
First edition? 1990?
1991 it came out.
Yeah.
Mm.
And then you did a DVD. And the reason you wrote the book was what?
Well, I realized that public opinion had moved forward, and it was time to come out more bluntly with how do you do it? How can it be done thoughtfully and intelligently? Now, Final Exit got acceptance, I think, because not only does it give the drug dosages which a person might use to end life and talk about the healing hood method and so, but it discusses how do you deal with your family in this situation? What note should you leave? What about life insurance? What about a living will? My book deals in a peaceful, careful manner. Yeah, there's a sting in the tail, true. But it's been published in 12 world languages, and it's in most world libraries, because it's a loving book, a careful book. Libraries have accepted it, and more blunt books that have tried to copy it have not been accepted into libraries.
And so it was, first of all, wasn't it self-published by the Hemlock Society?
Yes, when I had the manuscript, I had a distinguished literary agent in New York, took it to him, and he tried to sell it in America, in London, in Sydney, Australia, through the proper channels. Nobody would take it. And so I thought, well, to hell with you, I'll publish it myself, using Hemlock's money, but then Hemlock would get the hardback profits, because eventually it cost about $500,000 in printing fees. I published a very small edition, first of all, and when it got noticed via the Wall Street Journal, it took off, and I was printing 100,000 a week. It just roared away.
How did that happen, that it got into the Wall Street Journal?
Well, there again, it was chance. The distributor of the book in New York, he believed in the book, but he could tell that it wasn't. He above all knew that it wasn't shifting many copies, and he talked over dinner with the editor of the Wall Street Journal at the time, and interested him in the book. And the next day the Wall Street Journal telephoned me and interviewed me, and I talked about the book, and they said, who will hate this book? And so I told him who would hate it. Because they obviously wanted controversy and they published this article, and the book just took off. It was #1 non-fiction selling book in America.
It was in the how-to department, wasn't it?
Yes, and it ran on the bestseller list for 18 weeks. And it earned Hemlock Society just over $1 million of money they made good use of in trying to get laws passed and things like that. So.
And now it's in its third edition.
It's in its third edition, and I'm planning yet another edition for next year. But it's still selling reasonably well, but consistently. People don't buy it for fun, obviously, or for bedtime reading.
Insurance.
But when there's terminal illness in the family, either theirs or a loved one's, then it triggers, I better read that book, Final Exit. And it sells every day, 7 days a week, all the year, in paperback or digital form.
We sell it at our meetings all the time.
It never stops.
You know, it's interesting to me that I was a member of your board at the time you wrote that, and I believe you took a sabbatical to write it.
Hmm.
But what's interesting to me is that you didn't tell us that's what you were doing. And you didn't ask us our opinion. Because I would have said, oh no, don't write anything like that. You just went ahead and did it. And there you have it. I think that was really admirable. And I'm glad I didn't have anything to do with naysaying about it.
No, but I showed the board when I finished it.
When you finished it, yeah.
And I got the board to agree to a contract between us as to who would get the money and who and so forth. So the board was shown the finished product and agreed to publishing it. Well, they had to because they were going to foot the printing bill.
That's right.
It
was a shock, I have to say. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was a shock that Hemlock would be publishing such a book, since there was no, as I knew, no precedent for ever putting a book out telling people how to die. And look what's happened to it. It's been quite an addition to people's lives and peace of mind, I might add.
Yes.
And also, of course, the point is that people were jumping out the window, still are, and using violent and not necessarily successful means to end their lives. Mm-hmm. And you put a stop to that with that book because you told them the best ways to do it, ways that were reliable.
A lot of, especially our opponents and academics, have tried to search to see the statistics and the background of suicide generally to see if Final Exit has caused an increase in suicide. It hasn't. They cannot, over the years, they cannot find that the book has, but they do find that the book has brought about more gentler forms of suicide. And not quite as many people shooting themselves or jumping. So that's not what I intended, but if it's a side effect, then I'm pleased with that. If it's, but it's not meant for the unhappy or the mentally ill. It's meant, as it says, for the dying. That's in the subtitle. Who can think it through and handle this carefully.
I remember early on, too, we had a lawsuit by the parents of a young man who used the book to end his life. And that was essentially dismissed, as I recall. So what is the legal protections you have for telling people?
Well, the First Amendment.
Yeah.
The book, the only place in the world where it's been banned is in France. But they already, before they banned Final Exit, they already had a law in France which says you cannot publish any books on how-to suicide. Mm. And so Final Exit came under that. Every other country in the world accepted it. And I expect it's sold in France now, I don't know. But I say it's gained. And there again, I repeat, I think it's because it's a peaceful, loving book, but also hard nuts and bolts in the final chapters.
So that lawsuit that was brought by the parents of this kid was just essentially dismissed because
it didn't even get to court. Because you can't sue a book. I'd noticed that a young, I'd read in the newspapers, a young man in another part of America had written a book how to make a nuclear bomb.
Right.
And he wasn't prosecuted.
Right.
And I thought, well, if he can do it, I can do it.
So the other arm of Hemlock changing the law, I was on the board when you, I'll say we, but you, developed this 5-year plan, and that was to try to, you had done research on which states had a ballot initiative way of changing the law, and then the decision was to try 3 states in the next 5 years, which were Oregon, California, and Washington. And that's what happened.
Yes, it wasn't quite as straightforward as that. There was no law, even an outline or a model of such a law. So every Saturday morning throughout about 1985 or 80, myself and some lawyers sat down on a Saturday morning, and mainly them, but with me as sort of background advisor, we hammered out a new law.
The Humane and Dignified
Death Act, which is the first model law in America, because at last you had something to work on. Okay, it's been much modified and you know, polished since then.
And made more conservative.
But we came out with the first model law to cover this subject.
So I met you in 1986. I had been involved in the right to die in a case that I was involved in 1983,
Yes.
Elizabeth Bouvier case. And then I had a conference here, sponsored by the ACLU and the Bar Association and the medical school. And you were one of the speakers, and the only one that had anything original to say. And that was 1986, and then we started the Hemlock Society of San Diego the
Yes.
following year. And then you said, oh, we're going to try to change the law next year, and we need to collect 450,000 signatures. So get started.
Yeah.
So we did here in San Diego. We collected, I can't remember, 22,000 signatures. But then, what happened?
Well, it was a bigger job than we thought, gathering that, some 400,000 signatures, and we took on more than we could handle. People like you and your colleagues, you know, came forward, did their level best, but usually that amount of signatures, you use paid signature gatherers, because we didn't have the money to do that, so we didn't gather. We got a lot of publicity. We got what I think was valuable. We got a lot of good critiques of our law. People pointing out what was right, what was wrong, how could it be improved, and it got the debate going. How do you legalize this sort of action? And so, although our initiative drive failed.
Well, it was aborted. It didn't fail. I mean,
Well,
you just stopped it in the middle.
Yeah, well, it failed in the sense we didn't qualify it.
That's right.
And but it had its benefit. And the membership of the Hemlock Society jumped. I think it doubled that year. It showed that we were genuine, level-headed, democratic people who wanted to do this correctly and decently.
So that was 1988 when that whole effort was aborted. But then we went to Plan B, which was Washington, state of
Yes.
Washington. And if I remember correctly, the Hemlock Society financed the effort in Washington for 3 years, paid the salary for Ralph Miro and the rent
Yes.
of
Yeah.
the headquarters. And they put on a very good show. They
Yes.
collected their signatures.
Yeah.
They did a lot of good publicity. They had very diverse backers of the religious people, doctors. But it only got 46% of the vote.
Well, that was pretty good.
It was pretty good, yeah.
It was only lost by about 4 or 5%.
Yeah.
And but a lot. But there again, we got people talking and thinking, and we demonstrated our wish to legitimize this and do it the American way, you know, and we learned our lessons from our failure in Washington.
Well, the next year we went again back to California with Americans Against Human Suffering.
Yes.
Even though we knew we didn't have enough money to do it.
Yeah.
And we collected the signatures that year. This time Hemlock of San Diego got 35,000 signatures. And that's not dropping the bucket out of 450,000. But that ballot initiative also got 46% of the vote.
Yes.
Which
Yeah.
also was very good considering we had
Yeah.
zero money after the signature gathering campaign.
Yes, in California particularly, you need multi-millions because it's such a big, scattered state. Huge groups of population from San Diego to Sacramento, and in between, and you have to have very expensive television coverage, and we were not able to rise to that. But there again, it was worthwhile, worth doing.
It was.
Keep it going, show the way, and learn as you go along.
Because the next effort was in Oregon,
Yes.
1994.
Yes. Yes.
And again, Hemlock contributed significantly.
Oh, most of that, yes.
Yeah.
We contribute most of the money to that. and we contributed our mailing lists and we took it to the legislature first of all and said, will you pass this law? And they just laughed us out of court.
Well, the legislator who put that forward was Barbara Roberts' husband. Barbara became governor.
Yes.
And he had cancer.
He had cancer, yes.
And still, no response from even the Oregon legislature.
It was right to take it to the legislature and test them out and say, well, look, we've tried them, now we'll go to the vote. And Oregon is Oregon pioneered the initiative vote, changing the law by citizens' votes. And Oregon, and we and the people who did it, we'd learned from our mistakes in California and Washington. And a very competent campaign was fought. I kept out of it mainly because I was head of a non-profit organization. We went as far as we could legally, but up to that, beyond that point, a group of people in Portland ran it, and they knew what they were doing, and they watched other people try and fail. And blow me, in 1994, we won. By
51%.
A mere 2%, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And still it didn't go into effect.
No,
because it
the
was
Right
litigation.
to Life movement moved in immediately, found a tame judge, and got an injunction to stop the law from operating. And this judge kept on stopping it, allowing injunctions to stop it. We got to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, and they said, "You must allow it. You can't stop it. Keep stopping it like that." You see, it was this tame judge that was on their side, and but the Right to Life side then managed to get the legislature to put it back to the vote again 3 years after it had arisen. That was the biggest mistake they ever made. People voted again, and we won by 10%.
60% voted right to have it. That's right.
And it confirmed, so we had 2 positive votes. And they made a great mistake in taking it back to the vote for the second time. It just emphasized.
But you live in Oregon, Derek. Is there still opposition to the law there?
Oh, some, yes. People of strong principles, and mainly Christian Catholic principles, oppose it, but there's nothing they can do about it. There was one other hurdle. A week after the 9/11 disaster, George Bush signed an executive order which words to the effect that the Oregon law would be killed. That any
Because of the drugs
doctor
that were
who took part in it would be prosecuted immediately.
That was John Ashcroft, yeah.
Yes, but John Ashcroft was the Attorney General. Within a week, you'd have thought they had more to do on their hands than the week after 9/11. So we challenged the Oregon people challenged the executive order to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they said, "Oh, no way, the president's wrong. States must decide themselves whether or not they want this type of law." A very intelligent decision. He said, "Leave it alone, let Oregon law stand." So
that
we won in the Supreme Court as well.
That case won in the Supreme Court, but then it was 1996 when I became your successor as head of Hemlock that Catherine Tucker and Compassion in Dying challenged the law against physicians helping people die in Washington and in New York. And that case went to the Second and Ninth Circuits, and she won decisions in both circuits that said that there is a constitutional right for people to be able to get help in dying from their doctors. And then in 1997, that was overturned by the Supreme Court 9-0.
Yeah.
And then, but they said each state can decide. So of course, that was July of 1997. In November, the Oregon law went into effect. So it's a long way to go, but it's going to be, looks like it's going to be state by state, much like same-sex marriage and medical marijuana, do you think?
Yes. And I think modern thinking of younger generations tends to be in our favor. I think the fact that mixed marriages and gay rights and abortion rights have gained huge acceptance across the country now, whereas 10 years ago you would have thought, well, that's not likely to happen, mixed marriages. And we're riding on a tide of a change in public opinion, mainly because of young people. The millenniums, as they're known, tend to be on our side. And the religious forces are not as powerful as they used to be.
Of course, Massachusetts just recently had an initiative which lost by 1%. That was very sad.
Yes.
Because that looked like a very well organized campaign. And then in 1990 we did one in Maine that also lost by 1%.
Yes.
So,
oh yes, we've had our defeats.
Yeah.
And, but
to change the subject a bit, I remember you and I were sitting in Maastricht in Holland for a world conference. If I remember this correctly, we heard on television that Jack Kevorkian had just helped a woman named Janet Atkins from Oregon who had Alzheimer's die. And I don't remember what your reaction was.
Well, my reaction was stated. Dying in the back of a van is not death with dignity, but what else could the poor woman do, as her doctors had abandoned her?
Well, as her husband said later, that was the best place she could have died because at least she had help to die.
Yes. She was the only person with that disease that Kevorkian never helped. What was it?
Alzheimer's. She had Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's, yeah. There's no record that Kevorkian ever helped anybody else with Alzheimer's.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And Kevorkian was both good and a bad influence. I mean, he brought tremendous attention to the subject of. He was a doctor with a suicide machine who helped patients to die. I mean, it was a media dream that so he became the star of the media. But the counter side that I noticed, 9 different states moved to pass laws against assisted suicide.
Including Michigan, where he was.
Yes.
Because when he helped Janet Atkins, there was no law.
I said at the time, we're running backwards with him because we're going to have to undo these laws that are being done, and we have bumped into them in recent years as they've been tested.
But even in Michigan, essentially, through his civil disobedience, that law was not followed. Even after they passed it, after Janet Atkins, he kept helping people and not being prosecuted because he had 3 acquittals.
Yes, well, he was prosecuted, and there were 3 acquittals.
Yeah, and then they stopped prosecuting.
Yeah.
And the Oakland district attorney lost his job because he was going to continue to prosecute.
Yes.
But you and Kevorkian didn't get along very well, if I remember.
No, he was. I mean, I had nothing against him, but he couldn't make out why a journalist should be the leader of the Hemlock Society and a fairly important voice, and with books like, and he thought doctors only should be involved in this, and I'm, of course, not a doctor. And when he was in prison for the last of his offences, the final exit on DVD came out, got a lot of attention, and from prison, through his lawyer, he issued a statement condemning it. He's never seen the DVD, but he'd read about it, and he just couldn't stand the thought that I could say these things and draw attention. It was for doctors only.
Well, that's right. His first book was Prescription Medicide, because he felt so strongly, as Compassion and Choices does too, that it has to be done by a doctor.
both our books came out roughly the same time. Mine was a huge success as it turned out. His book was a failure, sold hardly any copies, and he was very upset. So people have told me who knew him, and
I was a big fan of his.
I tried to keep a healthy respect for him, and I contributed some of my own money to his defense fund and that sort of thing when he was in deep trouble on a murder charge.
The Right to Die community was not in his favor at all, but the leaders of the Right to Die community. But if our members in Hemlock, when I was head of Hemlock, if I had said something negative about him, I think I would have had my head cut off.
Oh, yes.
But the board did not agree with that, our board, and were pretty upset with me because we did send him $35,000 that we raised, matched funds for his legal defense.
But the judgment, I think on Kevorkian, and try to be fair, what can you say nowadays about assisted death that is good and better that Kevorkian brought about? He has no legacy. All his stuff was publicity. I mean, every person that he helped to die, he was in a press conference next morning and announcing. He didn't leave anything behind that is beneficial to the Right to Die movement. You can't point to anything.
Well, there's certainly no books like you have left.
No, and
But
all
that
he brought
point,
in was a barrage of laws, which of legislators who didn't want him to come to their state. Only 3 of the 9 passed, and they were badly written. They were, had huge holes in them, which we found out later. But Kevorkian, he drew attention to the subject, and I give him credit for that.
I think at that time, right before he went to prison, there was 75% of the public in America, and elsewhere too, in favor of such a law.
Yes.
And that has gone down steadily since the disappearance and then death of Kevorkian.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't visible. When he appeared on 60 Minutes and helped Tom Yaut die using voluntary euthanasia method, it was watched by 60 million people.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And that was really the first time anybody could see how you could achieve a peaceful death through voluntary euthanasia.
You see, in his last case, the one that got him in trouble, he moved from assisted suicide to voluntary euthanasia, which is injection. He made a...
Which was totally appropriate for Tom Yaut.
He was acquitted every time he was charged with assisted suicide. He was acquitted, and rightly so. But he laid himself open with the injection. And
well, the crucial part there was the sentencing. The jury had no question, no choice but to find him guilty. They found him guilty of second-degree murder. But she, the judge, could have given him probation, any sentence between probation and the one she gave him, which was 10 to 25. And there was a lot of politics involved in that because she had presided over a trial where he was acquitted. And she was angling to be a member of the Court of Appeal.
He'd insulted her. I was present when he insulted her. So she was not sympathetic to Kevorkian, as you show. Anyway, he served his sentence with dignity and strength, and came out after 8 years, I think it was.
Because of his health.
And yes.
Yeah. When I was at the trial, and I was the only person from any Right to Die movement there.
Yes.
And there were 40 people from Not Dead Yet all lined up in the corridors, getting media attention like crazy. But we did not necessarily agree with that. But another thing that got you a lot of publicity was your domestic problems with Anne and then her subsequent suicide. And I don't know that the public has ever understood that, or despite your ads in the New York Times and your public statements about it, and how that affected the Hemlock Society, which seems to me, if I remember being on the board then, that it did not affect us negatively.
No, it was a painful divorce I had, and divorce happens amongst 50% of people. But it did not affect the Hemlock Society. In fact, because of the publicity, we gained a few extra members. I was watching it to
That's
see
right.
whether, and so people saw that it was a painful domestic dispute, which can happen to any of us, unfortunately, and it didn't affect things. And
You resigned. Our board at that time was very contentious. I don't even remember what the arguments were, but there was a lot of them.
mhm.
And at that time, we even had consultants coming in to run the board meetings and all that. And sort of in the midst of that, or because of that, or after that, you resigned. And I would like to hear from you why that was. I wasn't too clear about it myself.
Well, I put in 12 hard years on the Hemlock Society. I'd worked very hard, mostly 7 days a week. I would run the office all week, and then I'd be out traveling to meetings Saturdays and Sundays, and back in the office Monday morning. 12 years, and then, but Hemlock's had grown into 80 chapters and about 40,000 members, and I'm not a chief executive type. I'm not an office manager type. I'm a communicator, a journalist, an author, and it wasn't my sort of job running a big organization. And at that time, Hemlock's membership was rising. There was the $1 million in the bank, so I thought
From the sale of Final Exit.
yeah,
that you
the
contributed,
Final
yeah.
Exit. So this is the time to move on. And I wanted to go back to being a writer and communicator, and I remained as a Hemlock speaker for years after that. And it was just time to move on. The organization was healthy, and I wanted to move on.
I remember there was a time when the chairman of the board did not allow you to come into a board meeting.
Yes.
And
Well,
there was a police officer there stopping you.
when I left, the membership, so I'm told, dropped drastically.
Oh,
and I was very
definitely.
cross about this because they'd become very conservative, and people, members were defecting because the organization
Wasn't doing it.
it was being called a conservative organization, you know. And I said, this is not a conservative, this is a ginger group, this is a action ginger group, we're not conservative. So there was some, after I left, there was some bad feeling because I thought the organization was being badly run. So I formed another organization of my own.
Yeah, tell us about Ergo.
Yes. Well, I didn't want to outdo Hemlock or anything like that, and I wanted it to prosper, not to. So I formed an organization called Euthanasia Research and Guidance Organization, which would concentrate on literature and publicity and spreading the word. Nothing else, no court actions, no legislature, not gathering members. We didn't have memberships and that sort of thing. But using the sales of Jean's Way and Final Exit and so forth, through Amazon and so forth. Random House was putting out Final Exit. So we became a small, tiny organization distributing quality literature about the right to choose to die. But I didn't take on the other organizations, had no intention. But I thought there was a niche here that I could handle, and without too much of a strain, and it's been a modest success. Yeah.
Well, one of the things you did, well, among many, was you and John Hofstra started the listserv.
Yes.
Tell us about that. That is a marvelous means of communication around the world about right to die activities, free, available to anybody with a computer.
Well, I used my old skills as a journalist to I gather news from around the world from various agencies or newspapers or people telling me, And 3 or 4 times a week, I put out what's called a listserv, a news list, containing these stories, which can come from New Zealand or Germany or England or America, and it goes out to about 3,000 people who care about this subject. They're not just any old person. They're people who have chosen to subscribe to the list, and there's no charge for it. And I keep the movement informed about what's happening in a positive way about the right to die. And I don't print the opposition's viewpoints at all. They've got their own, the Catholics.
But there's interesting dialogues in there, even among us.
They've got their own outlets, enormous, so I let them. So that has grown, and via Amazon sales of books, and my own internet bookstore, and Kindle downloads.
So you have a bookstore that's available online, which is very helpful.
Yeah.
And you have a blog, which is also very up to date.
That has 5,000 subscribers. Plus anybody can go in and not subscribe if they don't, just read it. So Ergo gives out quality information all the time, and positive information, informing people as to what's going on in a sort of book reviews or film reviews or legislative action. We swing right across the world. And to me, it's been as a journalist, it's been very rewarding, and I use my skills as an editor to try and find out what is interesting and quickly and digest it and put it out to my subscribers.
I'm a member of your board in Ergo too, as I was in Hemlock, and I thought the way you ran both organizations was just fine with me, and there weren't big complicated meetings and spreadsheets and all the whole rest of it. But I think in Hemlock they wanted a little more information, data, accountability, whatever.
Yes, yeah.
And that's
why I left.
That's right. Became a
the organization had to be more infrastructure, more accounting, and all the rest of it. And that wasn't my thing.
Right.
So I handed it over. I want time to walk away when you can do better elsewhere.
Another thing that you and John started was New Tech. Tell us about New Tech.
Yes. Well, after the Oregon law was passed and came into being, there was a blank. Nobody else felt like trying to change the law in other states, and no progress was being made. And a group of us, John Hofsis and Philip Nitschke and myself, said, let's form an international committee and search for methods where people who are terminally ill can end their lives without breaking the law and without recourse to doctors.
Or violent methods. Or uncertain methods.
Yeah, nothing violent or bloody. And so my organization financed it. We brought in doctors and nurses and experts from around the world.
Engineers, divers.
Yes, all sorts of people.
Yeah, horticulturalists.
Could contribute. And we would meet in San Francisco mainly, because it was a good meeting point for people
Seattle
to fly
and
in.
Vancouver.
People would fly. We would fly people in from Australia or the Netherlands or whoever would seem to be able to contribute. And we had some interesting. There's no board. Nobody was in charge. I was the sort of liaison person, but I was not in control of it, or nobody. It was a meeting of minds, of intelligent people trying to seek out a method, and we researched diving methods and various gas methods.
Well, out of that came the helium method, which is
we came up with the helium
today.
method in 2000, I think it was. And after several false starts, we polished the method up, and we found that was the best available method was to use the inert gas helium inside a plastic bag, and death would come swiftly and peacefully and painlessly. And it has got its followers.
You know, at that time, I became head of Hemlock in 1996 after a 4-year hiatus in which essentially there was no leadership. And the Supreme Court in 1997 said, no, there's no constitutional right to assisted dying. And that was very discouraging to me.
Yeah, but the states could.
The states could do it.
Could decide for themselves.
Right, but it felt to me like it was going to be, as you said, a persistent legislative state going on and on and on. And when I came on board at Hemlock, when people called us in desperation, we would say, read final exit and call us in the morning and, you know, have a good journey.
Mm-hmm.
And that seemed to me inhumane and barbaric for old ladies who were frail and sick and alone to do it that way. So I started the Caring Friends program, where we trained people to go to people's homes, give them information and support. So we trained our first class of 28 volunteers in San Diego, actually, in 1998. But we didn't have a method then. But in 1999, our second class was taught the helium method. And since then, that has been what we recommend to people. And it has worked very well. And so we have New Tech to thank for that. And I just wondered if you want to continue with New Tech, or do you think it's a done deal already now?
Well, I've been putting out feelers and web pages and requests on the listserv, and nobody has yet come forward with any new ideas, which I would welcome, and my colleagues we would welcome new. They're just coming up rehash of old ideas, and we're still, New Tech still exists. We're open to action if but there's no new ideas there at the moment. Whereas the helium method, Ergo, my information organization, has sold thousands of copies of the pamphlet which shows how to use and make the method. It's downloaded every day, and copies now go with the book.
Here it is.
And yes.
Yeah.
That's been enormous. We sold 3,000. We're just on the 3,000 mark. People who've downloaded it into their computers, and it goes with every copy of Final Exit that is added to it. So many, I think, upwards of 10,000 have been distributed.
Yeah, we disagree about that too, I think, because I think we should continue with the kind of New Tech we used to have, where people would come and sort of be a hotbed of ideas that things grew out of. But leaving that aside, I want to talk about the World Federation of Right to Die Societies, which started the same year Hemlock did in 1980.
Yes.
And you were involved in that, weren't you?
Oh yes, I helped put it together. The first World Conference on this subject was in 1976 in Japan. It was quite a small conference. I didn't attend that. I wasn't really active in those days. The second one was in San Francisco in 1978.
That's the one you hosted.
And no. Concern for Dying hosted that one. But I attended it. I was working for the Los Angeles Times at the time. I attended as a reporter, and I gave a talk on Jean's Way and so forth, amongst other things. Then I met Sidney Rossoff, who's an attorney who was then the president of the Society for the Right to Die in New York, which no longer exists. But he and I talked, and we said, look, we must form a proper going organization. I said it should be called the World Federation of Right to Die Society. He drew up the bylaws and the Constitution, And in Oxford at the next World Conference in 1980, he and I proposed this constitution and name, and there was a lot of debate, and good debate amongst the probably about 30 right to die organizations there. There's more now, but and the World Federation of Right to Die was set up, and officers appointed, and secretaries, and newsletter, and the organization was going.
The goal
it was
of which
joint
is
drive of Sidney Rossoff and myself that made it into a formality and a going concern.
the goal of which is what?
Really, not a huge goal, to get people from around the world together every 2 years to exchange ideas and philosophies and thought, and get to know each other and see what we can learn from each other. I think that's the basic goal of the organization.
So since 1980, we've had 3 world conferences in the United States.
Yes.
And the first one was the one you had in San Francisco. What year was that?
That was 1988.
That sounds right.
Sounds right, yes. Hemlock put on the World Conference in
Right.
San Francisco. Went very well, and we got a lot of attention.
It was very good.
We got some very good speakers who
Got Willie Brown.
Willie Brown, the
Willie Brown.
Speaker of the California Legislature, and so it went on from there, and then.
Then
a
when
few
I was
years
head of
later,
Hemlock, well, in 2000, we
you
hosted
ran
it.
the next,
Yeah.
ran the next one.
And then last year, in 2014, the Final Exit Network hosted it.
Yes.
And I was president at that time. And you had been president. And you also won the Tenri Oto Award, didn't you? The medal you wore around your neck. And Dick McDonald has been president of the World Federation.
Yes, oh yes. It's a 2-year job.
Yeah. But interestingly, not every organization, even in the United States, involved with the right to die belongs to it.
No, no. They're so concerned with their domestic agenda that they don't see the world purpose of this. I think in the world you can learn from one another. What happens in South Africa, we might learn something, or they might learn something from us. So it's the exchange of thought and ideas that is what I'm fighting for, and that's what my news digest several times a week trying to.
Well, I think what we've always agreed is to be a big tent organization, and the World Federation and Hemlock too, and now the Final Exit Network, and to look at all possibilities. And some organizations that only believe in medically assisted dying for terminally ill patients would not find that compatible with their mission.
No.
But we have organizations that are still working on getting a living will in their countries, even like Japan, which is one of the largest.
Yes.
And some organizations like
yes.
the Netherlands, which is the
way
largest.
in front of everybody else.
Yeah, they're way ahead.
Yes, always have been. And we've learned a lot from them, and by going to the Netherlands and having their speakers come here. I remember paying for some of their speakers to come over here in the 70s, in the 80s, to come and tell us what was going on there, and how could we learn the do's and don'ts of this mission.
I must say that as head of Ergo and as head of Hemlock, you've always been very generous with the money that you collect in these organizations to finance interesting things to help the board members learn about the movement. I would not have been at that meeting, the World Conference in Maastricht, if you hadn't agreed to help me pay my way over there. And that was very helpful. You used to distribute books, new books to board members.
Mm.
That was commendable.
Yeah.
And even this last World Federation conference that you helped finance, because your money from Ergo brought people from out of this country who we could not afford to have brought from Colombia and all sorts of places.
Mm.
So that was very helpful.
Well, it's mainly the profits of my books the royalties from my books that go into Ergo, that finance it, as it used to, the Hemlock Society when it was there. I think all told, over since 1980, I think I probably, from the royalties of my books, been about $2 million. We know it's $1 million from Final Exit alone, but I think given all the other books, probably about $2 million overall. So we can afford to be generous, and I don't believe in money stashed in the bank. I think money is to be used to change the law, to reform society, to get on with it. You've got to keep level-headed, but when you have spare money, you use it to accelerate the cause.
So we're now in California. It's 2015. There's a good chance the law will change here in California in the next 5 years or so. There's sort of three ways this can happen. One is through the legislature, one is by ballot initiative, and the third is by litigation, the kind of litigation that Catherine Tucker is now doing in California and New York. Do you have any ideas about which you think is more of a sure thing?
Well, a ballot initiative, we need $30 or $40 million to pull it off, because our opponents, mainly the Catholic Church, would fight us tooth and nail. We don't have any established big churches on our side at all. The only church that supports us is the Unitarian Universalist Church, and they're a very small organization, you know, in terms of numbers and money and so forth. I would like to think that the legislature would pass the action which is now before them in California. It's not been a good record, and I'm not sure. Maybe the court case brought by Catherine Tucker, the lawyer, may succeed. I believe we've got to go forward step by step. Wherever we can make progress, let's make it. Whether it's mine or yours or whoever's, let's make progress, because we learn more about the public, about the laws, and we get people thinking about it.
To change the subject again, in 2005, you and Dick and I and several other people, Ted Goodwin, organized by Ted Goodwin, had the first meeting of the Final Exit Network. And that was to continue the Caring Friends program that I had started at Hemlock, but with the forthcoming merger, it looked as though the board would not continue the Caring Friends program, which you initially, I think, were not in favor of. Is that right? Do I remember that correctly?
Well, I had a worry as to whether it could be for members only, or anybody could apply. And I felt that I hadn't thought the matter through properly then. It's clear that if you're going to do something for people, if you're going to skate near the law, if you're going to offer as much help as possible, they've got to commit themselves to membership, which in the network is a $50 membership. So I am in favor of it. At that time, I was hadn't thought the matter through properly, and was puzzled as to which way. I mean, on the whole, I think I was right. I wanted anybody who qualified to get the help. So be it. I mean, we don't restrict people who get Final Exit book or that sort of thing. It's a freedom of choice. But it's worked out, I think, that Final Exit Network asked people for a $50 membership as a show of sincerity and genuineness.
It's supposed to be, as they say,
people things for free, they don't value it very much.
Well, as they say in Netherlands, an enduring request, so that belonging to a right to die organization would constitute some proof of an
Yes.
enduring wish to do.
Yes.
But you were on our founding committee, and you did lend the name of Final Exit to this new organization, the
Yeah.
Final Exit
Yeah.
Network,
Yeah.
and you certainly have been supportive of it ever since.
I put up the first $5,000.
And you and Dick and I are all senior advisors now to the network.
Yes. Oh, it's getting a hold, and it's going forward very well, I think. Yeah.
It's really the only game in town for most people,
Mm.
because most people don't have a law in their state. And many of those people that do have a law in their state are not terminal, so they don't meet the criteria.
Yeah. So, yeah.
So do you think, I mean, it's a very expensive operation, the Final Exit Network, to send people around the country, as you had pointed out initially in your resistance to it, send them at no cost. So 2 volunteers go to somebody's house in Kentucky or wherever the member is,
Yes.
at no cost, twice. And then we have our lawsuits to contend with in the Final
Yes.
Exit Network.
Yeah.
So it's very costly.
But people will I mean, once the lawsuit started against the Final Exit Network, I started a Liberty Fund, and people responded. Within a couple of weeks, I had $150,000.
It was amazing.
Which I put immediately into bailing some of the accused out and funding their attorneys' initial fees
Right.
until Final Exit got back on its feet to handle it himself. So people will respond when they see you're in trouble.
Right.
They,
So how do you feel about this movement at this point? Are you a lot more optimistic than you were in 1980?
oh yes, more so. Yes, but it takes time. I'm sort of more constructive about it. I remember at press conferences in 1980, people said, "How long is it before you get this universally accepted?" And I would say, "Oh, 20 years, 20 years." Well, it got the 20 years, and I'm saying we need another 20 years.
45
But
years
we
later.
are making progress step by step, and the progress in 2015 is accelerating. There's 24 states this year have got some form of right to die legislation being pushed in their state.
Nonetheless, we're behind Switzerland, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and
Yeah.
Belgium. So
Well, Switzerland's unusual. I mean, their law came into effect in 1942 and has worked well for them and within them. And it's been voted on several times and approved.
and very well for foreigners who go there and get help to die. But going to Switzerland seems a shame for Americans when they can
Oh, yes.
have help right in their
Costs a lot
homes.
of money.
Yeah, very expensive. And bureaucratic. There's a lot
Yes.
of paperwork.
Yes. But upwards of 100 Americans have flown to Switzerland to get assistance.
Yeah, not as much as Europeans, I
Well, no.
think, or Australians.
But then it's easy to get to Zurich, Switzerland from anywhere in Europe in 2 or 3 hours.
But they don't have Final Exit networks, so they don't have anybody they can call who will come to their home
Yeah.
and tell them how they can do it themselves. Which I think we're very fortunate to have that here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Derek. We're going to talk later on with Dick McDonald,
Mm, good.
and then we'll talk to our whole audience at the meeting
See what
of the
they throw
Hemlock
out.
Society of San
Yes,
Diego.
Yes.
And they're very anxious to hear from you and to ask you questions.
Yeah. And usually it's in these question and answer sessions you get to the nub of the matter, what people are really thinking about, worrying about.
They're worrying about how they're going to die, but don't we
Yeah.
all, I guess?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right.